Welcome to African American Conservatives, the soul of the conservative movement. I'm your host, Marie Strader. Please remember to like, share, subscribe. Please go to brightnews.com or anchor.fm/AACONS. We're talking history today here at AACONS. Today's guest has written a number of historical tomes and joins us today to discuss his latest. The history of this country is replete with examples of courageous young men and women who emblazoned the path to freedom and liberty. What's astounding about this, when you go back and study their lives, for the most part, these people are relatively young, at least by our standards. Very early 20s in most cases. That goes for the signers of the Declaration of Independence to people who were in battle, like the Alamo. So, very young people making life changing decisions for the good of our nation, mature decisions. But people aged the same today, I don't know that I could entrust my life to someone who refers to themselves as ghost self and can't handle the rigors of daily life. Daily life without battles being waged, as with the founding of this country. I mean, simple things like filling out paperwork without being triggered, working without melting down because you were asked to actually, well, work, or GoFundMeing everything because you need to heal from the trauma of everyday encounters. I live with survivors of real trauma. So these kids in these latest viral videos, one a transgendered barista crying because the shift leader dared to schedule this person for 8.5 hours with a crew of 4 and actually asked that work be performed. Quel dommage. The horror. Had this person actually been to Starbucks before applying, or known the uncaffeinated or undercaffeinated? Another viral story is about another trans student establishing a GoFundMe to be able to heal from the trauma of a non Black person dancing to hip hop in front of them on campus who pushed back when the trans student called them out on it. So we've got young people and not so young people who don't have the emotional maturity or capacity to do basic tasks like work or go to school, who comprise this upcoming generation. They'll be making decisions and voting. We're in for some real trouble. Brian Kilmeade is the co-host of the Fox News Channel's morning show, Fox and Friends, host of The Brian Kilmeade Show, and best-selling author. His latest book is The President and the Freedom Fighter, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and their battle to save America's soul, now available in paperback. He's been on the show a few times to promote his previous books. Welcome back to the show, Ryan.
I appreciate you having me on.
You are obviously a history buff, having written about Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, George Washington, and others. How do certain historical figures and episodes catch your eye as an author, and why did the relationship between Lincoln and Douglas do so?
Well, number one, I just think that I wanted to move in time right after Texas fights and wins their freedom from what we now know as Mexico. They get their freedom. I'm thinking, what's the next big thing? Well, the Civil War is a big thing, the most written about war we have, and Lincoln's the most written about president. David Blight did a fantastic book on Frederick Douglass, and I thought to myself, well, how do I do this different? And I thought, what if I focused on their relationship, since they kind of sparred from afar and then came together at just the right time, and they played such a valuable role. So I thought, why don't we try that? And after talking to some people, some historians said they thought it would be unplowed ground and I could do it. And what I always try to do is not write it from the perspective of I hope somebody at Harvard buys it. I want the average everyday American just say, you know what, I'm going to read this book. And if I really like one of these guys or another character in the book, I'm going to go follow up on that. So I want to help lay the foundation.
That's great. Readers of The President and the Freedom Fighter might be impressed by the many parallels between Lincoln and Douglas. Both were tall, both were erudite, even in their youths. Both suffered the tragedy of losing a child, and both were blessed with strong maternal figures, namely Sarah Bush Lincoln and Sophia Auld. What can you tell us about these women and how they influenced their young sons?
Well, I mean, with Frederick Douglass, never really knew his mom, got really raised by his grandmother, and then different, I guess, masters' wives was the one that taught him to read and write. And she did not know that that was not allowed back then, and she could have got herself in trouble. Thank goodness she later would shut him down, and that would be a life lesson to see somebody so warm change their mind because of societal barriers. That was, I imagine that's jarring. But I think Frederick Douglass deserves almost all the credit. I mean, he basically saw the people around him, saw what he could learn from all of them, the best he could, and then would move on. If he could find some redeeming quality in a person that would move his mission in life forward, he would do it, even if they were far from perfect people. And that describes who he is. And then he was able to meet up with his wife, who was a free woman of color, and then go to New York City and then make a life for himself there. Seems to have been a great parent, although it must have been away a lot. For Abraham Lincoln, his mom dies, I think when he was 8 years old. Dad goes out, leaves him and his sister all alone, goes out and gets another woman, brings her back, ends up being somebody else who was a positive figure in Lincoln's life. And she ended up having the same passion for learning, which is great because his father thought it was a waste of time. Reading books is a waste of time. He could be getting work done. So he was really facing headwinds in order to be successful. Everything about Lincoln and Douglas is they never should have amounted to anything. Lincoln actually obviously had it better than Frederick Douglass, who was born a slave, but Lincoln had it as bad as you can imagine, abject poverty. Dad basically rented him out to other people to work on their farm or to wrestle. He was working 12, 14 hours a day, and then he'd be working in a convenience store, saw what he can do. And then he said, yes, I want more in life, became a lawyer, a politician. And you read some of his writings, and I read all of his speeches. Definitely a humble guy. And Frederick Douglass knew he had to be extremely confident to do what he did. And by traveling the world and giving speeches and meeting with people and reading everything he could, he became one of the smartest men in America.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, to touch on something that you mentioned, you described Lincoln in his childhood as, quote unquote, essentially an indentured servant, being forced to work and to hand over his wages to his father and receiving frequent beatings. Do you think this experience was the root of his antipathy towards slavery?
Well, I think it was a lot. The way I understand it, 3% of the black population was in the North. A lot of them, especially, it's hard to believe for us, but back then news wasn't traveling.
Yeah.
So like for Lincoln to get on stage with William Lloyd Garrison in the audience and start giving a speech and talking about life as a slave, by almost all reports, people were just enraptured by it. They couldn't believe the horrors of it. They couldn't believe he survived it. They took off his shirt and they see the marks. And it became so real, and so many abolitionists were created after the reality was brought home. The way I understand it, Lincoln didn't encounter too much to slavery too often. He visited a friend, saw a slave trade, must have seen an auction, went down the Mississippi, got a chance to see the South. So he experienced it, but he was in and he was out. And I think what Lincoln sees is he always said to himself, you know, what is going on with slavery? Like, why is this even allowed to exist? But he never thought early on that blacks and whites are equal, but he thought everybody should be free. And in my mind, he absolutely evolved on that, much like Benjamin Franklin, one of the smartest men to ever walk the planet. You know, he was somebody who had slaves, became to understand that if you give people education, there's no difference. Color of the skin didn't matter. And he became a leading abolitionist. And I'd like to think that Lincoln was heading the same direction, especially as I chronicle in the book and it's been depicted in movies. As the Emancipation Proclamation takes root, it becomes clear that the blacks were willing to fight gallantly for their freedom and carry guns and for themselves brilliantly in the battlefield. it became clear that the person responsible most was Abraham Lincoln, and he was worshipped by the black community. In fact, when it first comes clear that Jefferson Davis had left, he said, I'm going to Richmond, grabbed his son, and wanted to see the White House that Jefferson Davis had set up. And as he lands, African Americans look around and they notice who he is, and they basically just want to congratulate him and thank him, and they're all in tears. And he begins to realize the magnitude, I think, in what he did and what he accomplished and how bad slavery was gradually as it became more and more real to him. So I think you look at somebody in their lifetime evolving on it. And I think by the end, when you see the way he greets Frederick Douglass at the second inaugural, when you see the way Douglass came back at him, you knew that if Douglass was dealing with a racist, he would have made it clear in all of his books, but he wasn't. He was dealing with a man who was of his times.
Right. Now, throughout the president and the freedom fighter, it's evident that Douglass looked at Lincoln with a bit of a side eye, much like how a contemporary pro-lifer might look at one of the politicians who say, I'm personally against abortion, but I support Roe v. Wade. Describe for us how frustrated Douglass had become by Lincoln's hesitancy to embrace the abolitionist movement.
I think very frustrated. And I think the fundamental reason is this. You have friends in your life that you expect a lot from. And when they let you down, it's crushing, and you give them very little leverage because you know what they're capable of. However, there's other people who are acquaintances. It will do something even ruder, or it's even more cavalier or possibly hurtful. And you're like, well, whatever, just keep that in mind. Never be great friends with that person. But when you see somebody who has great potential, whether it's the boss you have or somebody you're mentoring or somebody in your family, and they let you down and are not producing the way you want, you're twice, if not 4 times as angry. And he's reading about Lincoln. He's understanding who Lincoln is through the Stephen Douglas debates. He's reading the text, sometimes appearing in the audience, and he goes, this guy's special. This guy's got it. And when he wins, he shelves his plans to go to Haiti. And he's expecting him to win and declare Emancipation Proclamation, let everybody be free, grab guns, grab uniforms. But what Douglas thought, and what Lincoln knew, and what Douglas was surprised at, that Lincoln knew the North wasn't there. Although they didn't have slaves and they don't believe in slavery, they didn't believe in equality. And they weren't going to go for, let's get them all uniforms, let them fight together, pay them equally, and let's free them all up. So he had to deal with the country he had, not the one that he wanted or that Douglas wanted. So he had to wait. And 2 years in, it was the right time. They realized they needed him to win. They needed that it was necessary. They saw the evils of slavery. Hundreds of thousands are dead. Let's end this thing. Let's let these people fight for their freedom, African Americans at the time, and let's go in. Let's go do this. And they did. And I think that Douglas became so impressed with Lincoln, he became one of his chief recruiters. And he was working his way towards being an officer, but Stanton never followed in on his offer. But his sons joined the Army. So I think in the end, they were in a pretty good place together. And then that famous speech when he dedicated the monument, the Emancipation Monument, he basically said, if he went as fast as I wanted him to, he probably wouldn't have had a country. But by the pace of the country, by the pace in which the country was at, he was swift, direct, and right on time. So I think there's a difference between being the editor of a newspaper to being a speaker and an activist and a deep thinker and somebody who's in charge of a country. So you could study at a war college, but how many generals can lead you to war? So you really need that practical experience. And Lincoln had to deal with the country that was not there yet in the beginning of the war, but they were for the most part by the middle and end.
I want to touch on something that you said there. Why did Douglas oppose the hope that Lincoln and many other anti-slavery whites had before the war that freed blacks, that blacks be shipped to places like Haiti and Liberia?
You were interrupted there. Were you saying colonization? That whole idea of colonization?
Mm-hmm.
So it's a terrible idea. Obviously, at the time, there's a few different angles to it. I wouldn't know unless Lincoln was around. One of the things that people thought, Lincoln looked around and said, listen, these blacks and whites are never going to get along. This is terrible. How do I get out of this? What do we do? Well, we shouldn't have had slavery to begin with. Absolutely. So what do we do? Well, let's see if they want to go back. They came here against their will. Maybe their will is to get out. So he invites some African-American leaders to the White House and he says, listen, how do you feel about that? I'll give you some money, set you up with some housing. We'll provide the military to transport you. But do you, your friends and family want to go back to where you came from, where you were grabbed 150 years ago? And for the most part, every African-American that was confronted said, are you kidding me? We're Americans. We're staying. We're going to fix this country. We're not leaving this country. And they were insulted by it. Now, do you notice he didn't ask Douglas to go? And he knew that Douglas was the #1 African-American in the country, known around the world, known in Ireland, England, Scotland, speaking all over Europe. Everyone worshiped Douglas. So why wasn't he invited? There's a theory there, and I think it's solid. Lincoln had to show the country, I tried everything. And that we have to learn to live with each other. But until he tried everything and showed it, he couldn't just say it. So Lincoln took the slings and arrows of this idea that maybe some were in support of, but the Black community wasn't. And even though some did take the offer, it was horrible. It was a nightmare, a bad idea, which ended up even worse than the idea itself. But what it showed white America at the time, they said, listen, you understand, this is your country. Get used to it. We got to learn to live together. That's another strong theory by Lincoln biographers, is why Frederick Douglass wasn't invited to that pitch and why the press was. Think about this. The press was invited for the pitch in the White House for these African-American leaders to hear how much money they'd get, what kind of housing, what kind of demands would they need to leave the country. So if you were doing something so controversial, why are you bringing the press? Because you wanted word to get out that this Lincoln is trying everything to bring peace back to America, including righting a wrong, which is taking people against their will to the country to work as a slave. So that's a theory that a lot of Lincoln biographers have. But obviously in life, there are people who have ideas. They end up good, they end up bad. That was a horrendous one.
Well, given that, Brian, why are we, 150 years later or so, still talking about reparations?
I don't know. I mean, that's relatively new to me, besides studying the history books, something that's happened over the last 15 years that people are talking about that. And there's no doubt about it when you look back at segregation and separate but equal and the transition and the problems with the voting and threats to keep away from the ballot box, all bad. But as we look through history, there's a lot of good. A lot of great people stepped up to do great things. Booker T. Washington, Frederick Douglass. There's a lot of great white people, William Lloyd Garrison and Gerrit Smith. They did great things along the way. So they should be heralded, and along the way, they were villains. And there's other people that are just victims of their times. They were born and they grew up and they said, those people work for free and these people don't, and they're better than you. And that's what you learn at 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. And then all of a sudden you look around and you hope to go, wait a second, isn't this wrong? Like every 18-year-old is looking at America now today and say, isn't this all wrong? I remember there was a dialogue between, not to get too on a tangent, and when I was studying for this book, I remember this dialogue, and I wish I pulled it out. And everything I read, I didn't. But essentially, to paraphrase, it was this. Douglass was friends with a lot of white kids, and they didn't see any difference. They treated each other equally. And they talked to each other, and they said, we're just going to have to wait for the next generation to understand there's no difference with people with the color of their skin. And think about that. Here they are, probably in the 1840s, two 12-year-olds, 13-year-olds looking at each other going, there's no difference between us.
Yeah.
Now they've evolved, but that 72-year-old or the 68-year-old, let's say, or whatever the 62 is old then, they grew up in that environment. Like Jefferson knew it was wrong, but he didn't create it. As smart as he was, he didn't shake it. They knew they wanted to set us up to phase it out. That was their goal, because to stop it on a dime back then, the best I can ascertain, I didn't live then, was going to be economically impossible and impossible to convert people. But they fundamentally knew it was wrong to do that to another human being. But all you do in 2022 is say, don't think 2022. And we know how wrong it is. Think about 1712 and think that this was existing in every continent, and think that Indians had slaves. I can't do the definitive history of Africa, but I heard African tribes had slaves of other tribes. You probably know more than me. So we are the hardest on ourselves. If you're born here and you look back at my great-great-great-grandfather and mother was a slave, were sold, I understand the anger, but don't blame me, because I'm just as horrified as you are. But right. I don't hate the country. I see the process that we went through to get where we are today. And I still say the most successful multicultural country in the history of the world that people are still trying to break into while we speak.
That's absolutely right, and to your point, that's one of the issues I think that I find most disturbing is, people talk about this country, and yet we have the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. We have a country who has leveled the playing field. We were talking just recently on the podcast about how there are no barriers to anyone being admitted into a university anymore because of the color of their skin, or because they may have a disability, or because of their gender. So it's hard to understand
Right.
some of the rhetoric that we're hearing.
And I almost think when you see the struggles that Douglas had and Booker T. Washington went through, and how they innovated and changed perceptions of generations, it's almost an insult of what they accomplished and how they moved us forward to go back with anger and condemn a country that has so many heroes along the way to make sure that we evolve to the point we're at right now. Now, I think people are going to look back at 2022 at 50 years, 100 years, who knows, maybe 10, and say, what were you people thinking? How could you even assume that these things that we take as natural, they're going to, how it's horrifying that you would even accept that. Why was that okay? And we're going to look around and go, well, it was okay then. In 2022, it was totally natural. Everyone did it. Everyone was used to it. We all dressed this way. We all acted this way. That's the way we did it. But guess what? In 2060, they'll be more evolved than we are now. 2070, 2080. Right. But I don't want them to condemn 2022. And I don't think they'd want us to condemn 1850 or 1960. I think when you come in, we analyze, we're horrified when we see black and white water fountains. We see the bus, as I did at the Ford Museum, where Rosa Parks was told to get to the back of the bus and she wouldn't. That bus is in a museum. Why? Because we're proud that there was somebody named Rosa Parks who was an American that stood up to change things that we know now, and she knew then was wrong. And she did. But I don't think she hated the country. Douglas never hated the country. He began to understand that William Lloyd Garrison had it wrong. The Constitution didn't have to be ripped up. He began to understand that Gerrit Smith had it right, that we have to live up to our Constitution and start living up to the ideals that were written. And if we didn't like it, we can amend it. It's built into it. And we did, 13, 14, 15. So that's how I feel. I don't pretend to know it all, but I think that people need a humility. Like I just said, I don't know it all. And I'm not smart enough to condemn everybody who lived before me. And I don't want to take the slings and arrows of people want to judge me after, because we're all subjected to the era in which we live. And we should just salute great people like Douglas and Lincoln for who they were and where they came from. They came from nowhere. No other country would you be able to rise from nowhere, literally a slave, to one of the most respected men in the free world. And we know Lincoln is still looked at as the greatest president we ever had.
That's right. Now, you described John Brown's attempt to recruit Douglas to assist him in his famous raid on Harper's Ferry. What role did Brown have for Douglas, and would the outcome of the raid have been different if Douglas had agreed to help?
I think it was, my opinion, it's a suicide mission. Idealistic to think they could pull it off. What they wanted to do is use Douglas's name and fame to rally the slaves in the South to rise up against their masters and fight for freedom, report to the garrison, get some arms, and take a portion of the country, perhaps. And Douglas said, well, I appreciate the sentiment. I'll take a pass, thank you. But all his paperwork was everywhere, and the meetings were prevalent. And, Uncle John Brown was an uncle to his kids. He was over so much. So you can't pretend there was no link. But Douglas didn't think the South was ready. And to me, he was right.
Now, you mentioned Lincoln inviting Douglas to the White House to discuss, quote unquote, the grapevine telegraph. Why was this meeting the origin of their friendship?
Well, Douglas got online, and you could get online back then and go see the president. I'm not sure he'll see you, but even though they're in the middle of a war, think about this. No fence around the White House, line up to see him. No security, maybe one person. Maybe that's why John Wilkes Booth was successful, by the way.
Yeah.
But as soon as Douglas got online, word went out. They passed the word, that he's there. He walked right past sitting senators. They ushered him right in. And that's when the two engaged almost immediately. Frederick Douglass, great to see you. And Mr. President, thanks for seeing me. He described seeing the president so long and so big for the chair, he sprawled, his legs went into 2 rooms. And they just got into it. Why did you do this? Why did you do that? What about whatever free the slaves? What's your timing? Let me show you the paperwork I had. I know you've been you condemning me in various works about X, Y, and Z. And they hit it off to the point where they were supposed to meet again. And then Douglas had a previous engagement. Then they met and they talked about how they were going to form their own John Brown insurrection and rally the African Americans to rise up against the Confederate Army and to rise up against their masters and let them know a way out. And just as they were devising this, Grant went to town and started having huge success. And they said the first thing I got to do is get reelected, because whoever has president right now is I'm pretty much the only one that was going to hang in there and win this war. And Douglas said, all right, I'm going to help you get reelected. Let me go to work for it. Let's come up with a strategy. And they worked on that. They worked on the insurrection. They worked on equal pay for African Americans. They worked on officer opportunities for all the infantries they were setting up, all the black infantries they were setting up. So they immediately just hit it off, and they had so much to cover. And I always say this, that if Lincoln was allowed to finish the 1860s between Grant, which we now know, we didn't know how special a person he was for years, and from what we know of Douglas, can you imagine those 3 flooding the South with teachers and housing and helping with the transition, using the Army to provide security? And I believe that even though there would have been hiccups regardless, and some version of the KKK and people intimidated at the voting booth for a while, I think for the most part, if Lincoln was allowed to survive the 1860s and fill out his term and maybe a third, I don't think we would have needed the 1960s.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, as I alluded to in my monologue, history is replete with stories of young men and young women who have made a difference in this country, many in their early to mid 20s. I think of our mutual friend, Alan West, who reads the letter from William Barrett Travis. But today, people in the same demographic are rushing to safe spaces triggered by work, math, milk. Yeah, I blogged about that one. Milk. What has changed to put our youth on that trajectory, and how do we change it back?
This is a good question. They say it comes from schools. I mean, I'm seeing it with people that I know, young people that are just militant. If you're a white person, you're privileged, and you should, get out of the way of socialist tendencies. You should give up what you have, because obviously you got it by cheating for it, and no blacks could ever be successful. No minorities will ever thrive. We are a country born on stolen land, which was fueled by slavery. Really? Thanks for that. Usually our enemies would say that about us. Now we're saying it about ourselves. I imagine it's coming from the schools, and I hope people are alerted to it. And if we could find a way to have the money that's afforded, let's say a public school for me would have been back then maybe $5,000. Well, instead of putting me in public school, give me that $5,000 voucher and let me go somewhere else. Because if they're going to teach that, you're going to lose a lot of students. And that's the only thing that would change the curriculum. When these public school classrooms are half full and there's no teaching jobs to be made, these unions wouldn't have a leg to stand on, and they'll have to change. That's what I hope.
We see this rush to erase history. Again, I'm triggered. Everything triggers me. And this push to resegregate ourselves. Why are we so uncomfortable to have difficult conversations about the history of this country? And what can we do to reverse it?
Well, I'm trying. I mean, I just want to tell true stories, build them around the quotes of the people. Make sure there's tons of footnotes, and let people know this is your history. This is how special these guys were. I mean, here's how, and women, and here's how flawed they were. I'm right, Sam Houston, the Alamo Avengers, right before the President of Freedom Fighter. And what I did in President Freedom Fighter, I talked about what you just mentioned, Marie, and that is what's happening in the news around this story. What's happening in the news since it published is they ripped Frederick Douglass's statue out of the ground,
Yes.
2 of them in Rochester. So that's in the afterwards, which you're going to find in this book.
And the Tuskegee Airmen. It's
Yeah.
crazy. Yeah.
You should be making extra monuments, not taking them away. What is the mission? And then they're trying to take Lincoln off of grammar school, and the monument that was dedicated. I don't love the design. Frederick Douglass didn't love the design, but it was paid for by this Freedom Monument, shows an African-American based on a real person.
Yes.
Standing up, breaking off chains, and Lincoln
Yes.
standing over them. And a lot of people in the Black community and the white community said, it's not a great image. I mean, whose idea was this? Can I tell you whose idea it was? It was freed slaves who paid for this. Maximum contribution was $5, and hired Thomas Ball, who happened to be located in Italy at the time, to make a design, a sculpture that would talk about this great moment 10 years after his death by this great president. So Douglass looked at it and said, yeah, don't love this, but I dedicated. I understand what they're coming from, and it does show a Black man rising. So I understand the symbolism. But then when things start going George Floyd crazy, they start coming for this monument. And I believe if it wasn't for the great-great-great-grandson of Frederick Douglass to say, leave it.
Yeah.
And I suggested you put another statue of Douglass maybe reading his famous speech that he gave that day in the park, Lincoln Park. Why wouldn't that make more sense? They haven't done that yet, but I'm big into that. So you want to put context around Jefferson, put a plaque there. And if not, why don't you put other great moments around Jefferson statues? So I looked down and I said, okay, that statue was built in 1820. Man, that looks good, or that looks beat up. Instead of, I have everything in my past from imperfect people. They're all taken down. So we become a nation of pedestals. So instead of going to Jefferson and learning what the people back then thought of him, and then seeing the plaque of the negativity, maybe you talk about the slaves that he had, the relationships that he had. Maybe you talk about it. Maybe that's there. He also had 126 slaves, whatever it was. You want to put that there? Absolutely. But don't take the past down.
That's right, because we have to learn from it. That's the whole point.
But look what you can learn from Jefferson.
That's right.
The guy never stopped reading and learning, inventing. Every day he set up a little hammock situation in between his living room and desk so he could sleep quickly and get back to work. Every day he was in the middle of 5 books. He just felt like there was so much to learn and to know. And this guy used all of that intellect, that brain power, to help form our country. And because he had slaves, I'm supposed to take down his statues and stop reading his books? Don't think so.
Yeah. That's right. If you're just joining us, our guest today has been Brian Kilmeade. His latest book is The President and the Freedom Fighter, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and their battle to save America's soul. Brian, how do we continue to follow your work?
If you just go to briankilmeade.com, I'm going to have a book tour. I'm going to be I'll be in Scranton. I'll be in Myrtle Beach. I'll be in Hollywood, Florida. I'll be in Brandon, Mississippi, talking about all my books on stage. If anyone's around there, I hope to see you. There's still some tickets left and VIP opportunities I could talk to you before the show. And I'll be right the next day in Tulsa, Oklahoma, then signing books in Oklahoma City. I'll also be in St. Louis, and I believe out McAllen, Texas. We have a great radio affiliate there. So I'll just be able to talk about this book again, but also add context, which I added to the book, so additional information.
Excellent. Thank you so much for being our guest today, and I hope you'll come back and talk about the next book.
Yeah, thanks for reading in the great questions, Marie. Thank you.
Thank you.
And do you need to download this? Are you okay?
I think we're good.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. And there you have it, Brian Kilmeade. So let's see what DK thought about that. DK, come on in.
Hola.
Hola. What did you think?
Yeah, I thought it was a great book. He made a lot of interesting points. One point I wanted to mention was that I think he was right about Lincoln, that if Lincoln had come into office as the great emancipator that he became, that he probably would not have come to office. I don't think the country was ready for a Republican politician to declare on first day of the job that he was going to free the slaves. I don't know if even the North would have accepted that at the time. So we were blessed that Lincoln evolved at the pace he did. And I want to touch upon your monologue about how men and women of the past became great at a very early age. And I was talking about Frederick Douglass. He's a guy who was born a slave, spent the first 2 decades of his life as a slave, and did not even know the alphabet until he was 12 years old.
It's crazy to think about, isn't it?
Yeah, it's amazing
Yeah.
how quickly he evolved, because by the time he was 20, he had just escaped slavery, and within a few years, this guy who had only just begun to learn how to read, he was known as a great abolitionist writer and a lecturer.
Yeah.
And he did a lot of great things. I noted a few. He was well respected by William Lloyd Garrison and John Brown, who were the two leading white abolitionists of the time. He was a he was a friend and encourager of Harriet Tubman. Spoke very highly of Harriet. I think he's the one who
Yes.
gave Harriet Tubman the nickname the General. And like Brian Kilmeade mentioned, that by Lincoln's second inaugural, that Lincoln had pulled Frederick Douglass to the side and said, "There is no man in the country whose opinion I value more than yours." And he continued his push for justice even after emancipation, as he became, for example, one of the leading spokespersons for women's suffrage. So he was always pushing for justice. He was always pushing to reform the country in a positive direction. And his quote for that was, "Where justice is denied, where poverty is enforced, where ignorance prevails, and where any one class is made to feel that society is a organized conspiracy to oppress, rob, and degrade them, neither persons nor property will be safe." So I think it's important for us to continue to recognize men like him, especially in the Black community. You know, the Frederick Douglass, the Booker T. Washingtons, the Harriet Tubmans, the even somebody our contemporaries like Clarence Thomas. We have a tendency, Martin Luther King, we hear denigrated by certain friends of ours who suddenly think it's cool to speak very poorly of Martin Luther King. We should appreciate these men and women more, because they built us up so much, and to tear them down, we're only debasing ourselves.
One of the points that Brian Kilmeade made that I think is so crucial, and it gives context to all of the things that we're talking about now in 2022, and that is to put what happened in the context of its time. We look back and we say, well, how come they didn't do this and da 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 da, and to have some of these conversations back then, and as you said, for Lincoln to come in and say, hey, I'm going to free the slaves, all of these things, these people lived in the times that they lived in, and we see great things from them. We see that they accomplished great things, but you know people had to evolve, and we don't give them the grace to be able to do that, and the political mechanism, I think, to do that. You can't just come in. I mean, maybe we saw Donald Trump do a little bit of that, because he I think, they talked about Barack Obama fundamentally changing America. I think Donald Trump did with the policies in 4 short years, the money that he gave to the HBCUs. Those kinds of things are things, instead of this push for reparations, I think money to HBCUs and all of these kinds of things actually move that needle more so than some of these other things that people are proposing. But yeah, looking at history through the lens of history at that time, not where we are now, not knowing what we know now, but at that time, some of these things were pretty groundbreaking.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to appreciate their evolution, but we should also recognize that evolution is not always a great thing. Um, I remember our prior guest, Robert George, he used to write about how we are evolving to a society where marriage is being devalued, or
Yeah.
maybe what's the word? Polyamorous marriages are becoming more in vogue, and
Yeah.
we, Kilmeade made a point that maybe in 2040 we'll look back on 2020 and be disgusted by some of our values. I'm not quite comfortable with that. I don't know what values we're supposed to evolve into necessarily. Are we supposed to be more? Are we going to evolve to be a more pro-life society or a more pro-choice society and so forth? So I think our predecessors have evolved in remarkable ways. Sometimes in a period of years, like Lincoln did. The Lincoln who was sworn in at the beginning of his first inaugural was completely different from on certain issues than the Lincoln who was sworn in at the beginning of his second inaugural. He spoke with people like Frederick Douglass and other abolitionists. He survived the war. His wife became an abolitionist. He paid a price, a pretty heavy price, but he did become a much better man. And we've seen other great men do that, from Benjamin Franklin, as Kilmeade mentioned. There was Calvin Coolidge, one of my favorite presidents. His views on civil rights were not quite the same. And Calvin Coolidge is another example. So there it is.
To your point, I think, as you said, evolution is good, but maybe regression is good too. I would never want to go back to the days of slavery, obviously, but maybe, as I alluded to in my monologue, when, to quote someone who is not really known for his tact, Archie Bunker, when men were men, but just going back to the foundation of this country and thinking about the ages of some of these people, I do become quite concerned in 2060, should the Lord allow us to see it, kind of what our world will look like looking back at 2020, when this was the standard of, that we said that masculinity was toxic. So people like William Barrett Travis and others who forged the path of this country would not have been allowed to rise because that masculinity is toxic.
Yeah, you could not imagine. I think someone of my father's generation could not imagine a 18-year-old crying over 8-hour shift. Your hourly employer, you want 8-hour shifts. You want 16-hour shifts because you get paid by the hour. So, and in some ways we're evolving, other ways we may be devolving. So, hopefully we'll get on the right path and maintain that.
So there you have it. We are wrapping up this episode of African American Conservatives, the soul of the conservative movement. I'm Marie Strotter saying please sign up at brightnews.com or anchor.fm/AACONS, and we'll see you next time.